In the year 2020, a team of scientists cracked open more than 400 Viking skeletons pulled from graves across Europe and Greenland, and what they found inside those ancient bones sent shockwaves through the entire field of history. For centuries, everyone assumed a Viking was a Viking, one people, one bloodline, sweeping out of Scandinavia to terrorize the known world. The DNA said otherwise. It revealed a tangled, surprising web of ancestry, intermarriage, and migration that rewrote the textbooks overnight, and buried inside that same genetic data was something even more personal. A direct trail leading straight from those 1,000-year-old raiders to surnames that ordinary families still carry on their mailboxes today. If your last name happens to be one of them, you are not just imagining a connection to the Viking Age. The blood in your veins may prove it. Stick around, because before we count down, I need you to do one thing. If you spot your surname anywhere on this list, drop it in the comments so we can see exactly how many descendants of the Old Norse clans are watching this right now. And if uncovering the true story hiding behind your own name is the kind of thing that fascinates you, subscribe, because a brand new ancestry mystery lands here every single week. Now let's get into it, starting at number 15. At number 15 sits Olsen, along with its close cousins Ulfson and the anglicized wolf. Every version traces back to the Old Norse word ulfr, simply meaning wolf. But among the Vikings, a wolf was never just an animal wandering the forest. It was the emblem of the Ulfhednar, the wolf-skinned warriors who fought beside the Berserkers, men who supposedly worked themselves into such a frenzy before battle that witnesses swore they had taken on the spirit of the animal itself. Historians still debate whether these warrior cults used hallucinogenic mushrooms, self-induced trance states, or pure battlefield adrenaline to reach that condition. But either way, enemies describe them as nearly impossible to kill through fear alone. If your family carries the Ulf name, the odds are strong your line runs back to the rugged fjord coasts of Norway, or the windswept shores of Denmark, exactly where these fighting cults were most concentrated. Modern genetic testing on descendants frequently turns up haplogroup I1, the marker researchers consider the closest thing to a genetic fingerprint for ancient Scandinavia. It shows up again and again in graves containing weapons, shields, and the remains of men who clearly spent their lives in combat. In Norse poetry, the wolf and the raven were constant companions on the battlefield, feasting on the fallen once the fighting ended, and to be named after the wolf was to be marked from birth for a life lived close to violence and death. Number 14 belongs to Steen, sometimes written Stein, Steen, or Stenson, drawn from the Old Norse Stein, meaning stone. Norse parents did not throw this name around casually. To call a child stone was to declare, from his first breath, that he was expected to be solid, unshakable, and dependable when the fighting started. Some of the oldest runestones still standing in Sweden and Denmark carry variations of this exact name, memorials carved by families who wanted their sons remembered as permanent as the rock itself. The Sten families clustered heavily in eastern Scandinavia, in the territory that would eventually become Sweden, and many of them joined the Varangian expeditions, the Viking bands, who paddled east down the great rivers of Russia and Ukraine, all the way to the gates of Constantinople. DNA pulled from this region frequently shows a blend of haplogroup I1 alongside R1a, a marker that stretches from Scandinavia deep into Eastern Europe, tracing the exact river routes those eastern raiders once followed. Some of these easterly Vikings even joined the legendary Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, and were paid in silver and gold that would have seemed unimaginable back in the cold north. If your surname is Sten or Stein, your ancestors may never have set sail for England at all. They may have turned east instead, toward golden domed churches and emperors, leaving their name carved in stone the entire way. At number 13, we reach Ragnvaldsson, son of Ragnvald, a name absolutely soaked in political power. Ragnvald was the name carried by the great Earls of Orkney, the Norse nobles who ruled the islands off the northern coast of Scotland as their own private kingdom for roughly 6 centuries. The most celebrated of them, Ragnvald Eysteinsson, earned such trust from the King of Norway that he was handed authority over the entire North Atlantic frontier, controlling the sea lanes between Norway, Scotland, and Ireland like a family business passed down through generations. And here is where the story connects to events almost everyone has heard of. Ragnvald was the father of a Viking named Rollo, and Rollo went on to carve out the region of Normandy in France, which means this same bloodline runs directly to William the Conqueror and the entire Norman conquest of England in 1066. The Earls of Orkney were not simply raiders passing through and moving on. They built halls, minted influence, and ruled for hundreds of years. If your family carries the Ragnvald name or its softer modern descendants like Ronald and Reynolds, you likely descend from one of the most politically connected dynasties of the entire Viking Age. Genetic surveys across the Orkney and Shetland Islands still reveal unusually high concentrations of Norwegian ancestry today, a full 1,000 years after the Earls first landed, proof that the Norse did not merely visit those islands, they settled, intermarried, and left their DNA woven permanently into the local population. Number 12 is Sigurdsson, and if this is your surname, your ancestors named their son after the single greatest hero in all of Norse mythology. Sigurd was the legendary dragon slayer who killed the monstrous serpent Fafnir, bathed in its blood, and supposedly gained the power to understand the secret language of birds. His saga was so beloved it was carved into wood and stone panels across Scandinavia for centuries, and it later inspired everything from Richard Wagner's operas to modern fantasy literature. Naming a son Sigurd meant placing the highest possible expectation on his shoulders from birth, a demand that he grow into something close to legend. Sigurdsson families spread widely across Norway and Iceland, and the name remains one of the most common in Iceland to this day. Icelandic DNA happens to be some of the most thoroughly studied genetic material in the world, because the population stayed so geographically isolated for so long that researchers can trace individual family lines back well over 1,000 years with startling precision. In several versions of the old saga, Sigurd's story ends not in triumph, but in betrayal and murder, a blunt reminder that even the greatest heroes of the Norse world rarely died peacefully in their beds. Modern Icelandic geneticists working with the national database Decode have used records like these to map entire family trees stretching back to the original settlement of the island in the 9th century. So a surname like Sigurdsson is not just a story, it is a documented line. Researchers can actually walk backward through generation by generation. At number 11 stands Gunnarsson, son of Gunnar, a name built from two Old Norse words meaning war and warrior, so it translates roughly to battle-ready. The most famous man to carry it was not simply a fighter, but the tragic central figure of Njal's saga, one of the finest pieces of literature the medieval Norse world ever produced. Gunnar of Hlitterendi fought so skillfully that his enemies could never beat him in open combat, so instead they cornered him at his own farmhouse. In his final stand, surrounded and outnumbered, he held them off until his bowstring finally snapped. When he begged his wife for 2 locks of her hair to repair it, she refused, still bitter over an old insult from years before, and Gunnar died because of that single refusal. That devastating scene has echoed through storytelling for 1,000 years. Gunnarsson families were common across Iceland and Norway, and the name still ranks among the most frequent surnames in both countries today. The sagas preserving his story were written down in Iceland centuries after the events they describe, and modern scholars still marvel at how emotionally sharp and human these ancient heroes feel, even after 10 centuries. Archaeologists have even located what they believe are the remains of Gunnar's actual farmstead in southern Iceland, giving families who carry this name a real, physical place on the map, where their story is said to have unfolded rather than just a page in an old book. Number 10 is Osborne, and this name proves the Vikings did far more than raid the English coast. They settled there permanently and eventually became English themselves. Osborne descends from the Old Norse Asbjorn, combining as, meaning god, with Bjorn, meaning bear. So the full name translates to something like Divine Bear or God's Bear. When Danish Vikings carved out the Danelaw, the sprawling territory across northern and eastern England, they controlled for generations, starting in the 9th century. They brought names like Asbjorn along with them. Over the following centuries, those Norse names slowly softened into English forms, turning into Osborne, Osborne, and Osborne. If your family name traces back to Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, or East Anglia, there is a real chance your roots lie not with the Anglo-Saxons, but with the Danish settlers who moved in right alongside them and never left. DNA surveys across northern England still light up with Scandinavian markers today, especially in the old Danelaw counties, where the Norse genetic footprint never fully faded. Entire regions of England still carry a faint Norse accent in their place names, and everyday English words like sky, knife, egg, window, and even the pronoun they came directly from these Viking settlers who reshaped the language forever. Place names ending in by, meaning village, and thorp, meaning farm, still dot the map across Yorkshire and the East Midlands by the hundreds, quiet fossils of an entire Scandinavian world that once governed itself under its own laws inside England's borders. At number 9 we arrive at Thorson, sometimes written Thorin, Thorson, or Thurston, and yes, this name comes directly from Thor, the hammer-wielding god of thunder, and by far the most popular deity in the entire Norse pantheon. Ordinary Vikings rarely named their children directly after gods, but Thor was the exception, because he was seen as the protector of common people, the farmer's god, the one you prayed to for strength and safety during a storm at sea. His name was woven into hundreds of Norse names, including Thorson, Thorvald, Thorbjorn, Thorgils, and in England, Thurston, which literally means Thor's stone. Anyone carrying a Thor-based name likely descends from a devoutly pagan Norse family. one that clung to the old gods even as Christianity swept across Scandinavia through the 10th and 11th centuries. You can see exactly how deeply Thor was loved in one small fact that surrounds us every single week, without most people noticing. The weekday Thursday comes directly from Thor's Day, a quiet linguistic tribute repeated by hundreds of millions of people who have no idea they are honoring an ancient thunder god. Small stone amulets, shaped like Thor's hammer, called Mjolnir pendants, have been dug up in graves across Sweden, Denmark, and even England, worn openly around the neck as a symbol of faith, long after missionaries had begun pushing the cross into Scandinavian villages. Thor-based names cluster heavily through Norway and Denmark, and genetic testing on these families frequently shows the classic Scandinavian signature of haplogroup I1 at strikingly high frequencies. Number 8, and arguably the emotional core of this entire list, is Bjornson, son of the bear. Bjorn comes straight from the Old Norse word for bear, and it was one of the most common, most respected names a Viking family could ever bestow. But the bear meant far more to the Norse than simple physical strength. It was tied directly to the Berserkers, warriors whose very name translates to bear shirt. Right before battle, these fighters supposedly worked themselves into a wild frenzy, biting their shields, howling and charging into combat wearing little or no armor, utterly convinced they had absorbed the raw fury and power of the bear itself. Contemporary chroniclers describe them as almost impossible to wound or stop through fear or pain, a reputation that terrified enemies across Europe for generations. To be named Bjornson was to be linked directly to that primal warrior tradition, and the name spread across every corner of Scandinavia, from Norway to Iceland to Denmark, splintering into countless regional variations along the way. Even outside of battle, the bear held a strange sacred status in Norse culture, and some sagas describe warriors who claimed the ability to shapeshift into one, a belief scholars now connect to the wider European tradition of animal spirit warriors found from the Baltic coast all the way to the Russian steppe. At number 7 is Ivarson, and this name carries one of the most chilling legacies in the entire Viking Age, because it points straight back to Ivar the Boneless. Ivar was one of the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, and he served as the strategic mastermind behind the Great Heathen Army, the massive Viking force that invaded England in the year 865. Where other Viking raiders struck fast and sailed home with their plunder, Ivar came to conquer and stay. He captured the city of York, executed the king of Northumbria in a brutal ritual execution, and carved out lasting Viking control across huge stretches of eastern England. Historians still argue fiercely over his strange nickname. Some believe it referred to a genuine physical condition that left his legs weak or brittle. Others suspect it described unusual flexibility, and a few think boneless was simply a dark metaphor for his cold, calculating cruelty in battle. Whatever the truth behind the name, Ivar was clearly no ordinary raider, but a commander who thought in terms of long campaigns, sieges, and the permanent conquest of an entire island kingdom. If your surname is Ivarson or Ivarson, your ancestors carried the name of one of the most feared military strategists the medieval world ever produced. Excavations at Repton in England, where Ivar's army is believed to have wintered in 873, uncovered a mass burial mound containing the remains of hundreds of Viking warriors, many marked by the kind of brutal battle wounds that match the chronicles almost perfectly. Number 6 belongs to a name that redrew the map of Europe forever, Rollo, sometimes rendered in Older Norse form as Rolfson. Rollo was a Viking leader so powerful that, in the year 911, the King of France essentially surrendered any hope of defeating him outright. Instead, the king struck a deal, offering Rollo the land he had already seized around the mouth of the Seine River if he agreed to defend it, and finally stop raiding the Eye, outskirts of Paris. That territory became known as Normandy, meaning simply land of the Northmen. Here's exactly why this matters to you personally. Rollo was the great-great-great-grandfather of William the Conqueror, the Norman duke whose invasion of England in 1066 changed the country's history, language, and bloodlines forever, which means anyone with genuine Norman ancestry, a group that makes up an enormous slice of England's population, is in some fashion connected back to this one stubborn Viking who simply refused to kneel. Within just a few generations, Rollo's descendants had traded their longships for stone castles and their Old Norse tongue for French, transforming from raiders into some of the most formidable knights in all of medieval Europe. That same Norman bloodline did not stop at England either. Branches of it went on to conquer Sicily and southern Italy, within just a few more generations, meaning descendants of this one Viking chieftain ended up ruling territory on 3 separate corners of the medieval map. At number 5 stands Knutsen, sometimes written Knutsen or simply Canute, a name belonging to a man who managed something almost no other Viking ever achieved. He did not merely raid England, he became its crowned king. Cnut the Great ruled England, Denmark, and Norway simultaneously. forging a vast North Sea empire that stretched across the top of Europe during the early 11th century. And he was no barbarian squatting on a stolen throne either. He was a shrewd, capable ruler who made peace with the church, protected his subjects under consistent law, and became one of the most genuinely respected kings of his entire era. There's a famous story of Canute ordering his throne carried to the seashore and commanding the incoming tide to halt, not out of arrogance, but specifically to prove to his flattering courtiers that even a mighty king had limits before the raw power of nature. Under his rule, England sat inside a genuine North Sea empire for nearly 2 decades, and for that brief, remarkable stretch, the sea connecting Scandinavia and Britain functioned less like a barrier and more like a Viking highway binding his kingdoms together. Cnut also married into the existing English royal line, taking Emma of Normandy as his queen, a political move that quietly tied his Scandinavian dynasty directly into the same web of bloodlines that would later produce William the Conqueror. Number 4 is Olsen, one of the single most common surnames across all of Scandinavia, spelled Olsen, 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 or Olafsson, meaning son of Ola or son of Olaf. The reason this name is genuinely everywhere traces back to one specific man, Olaf II of Norway, remembered today as Saint Olaf. Olaf began his career as an ordinary Viking raider, fighting battles across England and continental Europe as a young warrior for hire, but he eventually returned home determined to unite Norway under a single crown and a single faith. He forced the conversion of Norway to Christianity, often quite literally at the point of a sword, and he died in battle at Stiklestad in the year 1030 while attempting to reclaim his throne from rival Norwegian chieftains. After his death, stories of miracles attributed to his relics spread rapidly, and he was declared a saint, becoming the eternal patron of Norway itself. Because of his enormous posthumous fame, thousands of families began naming their sons Olaf in his honor, and over the following generations that produced an absolute flood of Olsens and Olsens across the country. The great cathedral in Trondheim was built directly over the spot where his remains were believed to rest, and it still draws pilgrims today. If this is your surname, your ancestors likely lived through the exact hinge point where Norway transformed from a pagan Viking society into a Christian medieval kingdom. Now we reach the top 3, and these are the names that genuinely shook the medieval world to its foundations. Number 3 is Ragnarsson, son of Ragnar, and if you carry this name, you are holding one of the single most famous Viking legacies in existence. Ragnar Lothbrok is the legendary Viking hero whose sagas have circulated for well over 1,000 years, and who has been dramatized for millions of modern viewers through television and film. Whether Ragnar was a single real man or a composite blend of several historical raiders is still fiercely debated among historians, but the documented impact of his sons is beyond dispute. His sons, including Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye, are widely credited with leading the great heathen army that tore through England avenging their father's death, and conquering entire Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the process. Bjorn Ironside reportedly sailed even further, pushing into the Mediterranean and raiding deep into the Italian coastline. To carry the Ragnarsson name was to belong to a dynasty that genuinely terrified the whole of Europe for a generation. According to legend, Ragnar himself met his end thrown into a pit of venomous snakes by an English king, and it was that gruesome death his furious sons crossed the open sea to avenge. If your surname is Ragnarsson, or a close variant, your ancestors were not quiet farmers content to stay home. They chased legends, crossed open oceans, and wrote their names into history in blood. At number 2 stands Haraldson, son of Harald, and this name is royalty in its purest possible form. 2 of the most consequential kings in Viking history both carried the name Harald. The first was Harald Fairhair, who, according to legend, swore never to cut his hair until he had united the whole of Norway under a single crown, and he ultimately did exactly that, becoming the first king to rule a genuinely unified Norwegian nation around the year 872. The second was Harald Hardrada, whose nickname literally translates to the hard ruler, and he earned every syllable of it. Before ever becoming king of Norway, he served as an elite member of the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, fighting battles that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the Middle East, becoming fabulously wealthy and famous across the entire known world. He died in the year 1066 at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, while attempting to invade and conquer England, just weeks before William the Conqueror landed on the southern coast, and changed the course of English history forever. If your surname is Haraldson, Harald, or Harrison, your ancestors carried the name of kings and conquerors who genuinely shaped the destiny of entire nations. And that brings us to number 1, the name that might be printed on your own mailbox right now, Erikson, spelled with a classic double S, or in its many other forms like Erikson, 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 and Erikson. This name means son of Erik, and connects directly to not 1, but 2 of the boldest explorers in all of human history. The first was Erik the Red, the fierce red-bearded Viking banished from Iceland after killing several men in a series of feuds, who responded not by giving up, but by sailing west into total uncharted territory and discovering Greenland, founding a colony there that survived for centuries. But it was his son who truly changed history. Leif Erikson, meaning Leif, the son of Eric, sailed even further west and became the first documented European to set foot on the mainland of North America, landing in a region he called Vinland sometime around the year 1000. That is roughly 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born. Just sit with that fact for a second. Half a millennium before the history books usually claim European contact began, a Viking named Erikson had already walked on American soil. Archaeologists eventually confirmed the truth behind these old sagas when they uncovered the physical remains of a genuine Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Hard scientific proof that the Vikings truly did reach the New World, complete with iron rivets, a bronze cloak pin, and the charred remnants of a genuine Norse boat repair workshop still sitting in the soil after 1,000 years. If your surname is any version of Erikson, your family name is permanently tied to the single greatest voyage of the entire Viking Age, proof that your ancestors did not simply raid the safe edges of the known world, they sailed straight off the edge of the map and found an entire continent waiting on the other side. If your name showed up anywhere on this list, then somewhere deep inside your DNA runs a thread reaching back a full 1,000 years, all the way to the longships and the cold northern seas that produced them. These were never quiet, ordinary people content with small lives. They were raiders, rulers, and explorers who flatly refused to accept the limits of their world, sailing further, fighting harder, and building longer-lasting legacies than almost anyone else in medieval history. And a piece of that same restless spirit may still be sitting quietly inside you right now, waiting. So here is what I want you to do next. If your surname appeared anywhere in this countdown, go check the video on your screen right now because it breaks down the exact DNA markers that can reveal precisely which Viking clan you truly descend from. Your ancestors have been waiting 1,000 years for you to come looking. Go and claim your bloodline, because the past is never really gone. It is simply waiting quietly inside your blood for the day you finally decide to go searching for it.